Welcome to the 2.4 notes on macromolecules. This is going to be a discussion about the compounds that make up living things. There are four major macromolecules that we will discuss here, and we'll take them one at a time. Now, this discussion about the compounds that make up living things is going to seem somewhat familiar because it's going to get into the things that we eat, the nutrients that we need in order to be healthy. In biology, in a very real sense, you are what you eat. So we're going to start off by talking about carbohydrates. Before we can get into carbohydrates, we got to go back to a little bit of basic chemistry. So the first question we have here is, how many valence electrons does a carbon atom have in its outermost orbital? A, 2, B, 4, C, 6, or D, 8? Carbon is one of the most important elements to life. In a very real sense, we can say that life on this planet is carbon-based because all organic compounds have carbon as one of its main components. The reason why carbon is so important to life is because carbon has some qualities that make it a very versatile atom. First off, carbon has 4 valence electrons. If you remember the octet rule, or the rule of 8, the outermost orbital of most atoms are happiest and most stable when they have 8 electrons. Carbon occupies a really important spot on the periodic table in that it has 4 valence electrons. So it's looking for 4 more electrons. Carbon is going to make a lot of different kinds of bonds in order to fulfill that octet. Another reason why carbon is very important to life is that it is one of the most basic elements. It's number 6 on the periodic table, which means it has 6 protons. Generally has 6 neutrons and 6 electrons as well. So it's a very small, very simple atom. And being so small allows it to twist itself into all sorts of different shapes that other bigger, bulkier atoms can't really get into. So carbon has a great deal of versatility when it comes to making different bonds. Carbon atoms are able to make single, double, and triple covalent bonds. In the example molecules that we have here, with just 2 carbon atoms and varying between a single bond, a double bond, and a triple bond, we can make a variety of different molecules with just carbon and hydrogen. These kind of molecules are actually an important base of organic life in that these are what we call hydrocarbons, in that they are made out of hydrogen and carbon. Carbon's unique characteristics allow it to make a variety of shapes. And here we have just a smattering of these different shapes it can make. We can have long chains of carbons, we can have rings of carbon, we can have flat sheets of carbon, we can have spherical shapes made out of carbon atoms. We can even have what are called carbon nanotubes, which are microscopic tubes made out of carbon, kind of like drinking straws. These nanotubes are interesting materials, and scientists are finding all sorts of new and different ways to use these in building really lightweight but sturdy materials. A lot of sports equipment is now being made out of what we call carbon fiber, which is made out of a combination of these nanotubes and other materials. The fact that carbon can take all these different shapes means that it's very, very versatile in terms of making the compounds necessary for life to thrive. When we talk about the compounds that make up living things, anything that is made out of carbon and has 2 or more carbon atoms is what we call an organic compound. All other carbon-bearing materials are inorganic. So CO2, carbon dioxide, for example, is an inorganic carbon. When we talk about the compounds of life, we're talking about big molecules that are actually made out of smaller components. So we call these big molecules polymers. The prefix poly means many, and the root word mer is in reference to a unit. So a polymer is many units. The polymers are made out of many smaller pieces that we call monomers. So mono means one, so one unit. We call the molecules that make up life macromolecules. Macro is the opposite of micro. Remember, micro means small. Macro, on the other hand, means large. So a macromolecule is a large molecule. These macromolecules are made out of many building blocks. So the monomers build the polymers. So when we talk about these macromolecules, there's a couple important details that we need to make sure that we know about each macromolecule. Number one, what are these macromolecules built out of? What are the monomers that build the polymers? And two, we need to know what these macromolecules do for the body. What are their most important function inside of a living thing? So the next question, which of the following is an example of a food containing carbohydrates? I'll give you a hint, there's more than one. The correct answer is all of them. All of these foods have carbohydrates in them in one form or another. You might hear people talk about, oh, I'm on a low-carb diet. And the problem with low-carb diets or no-carb diets is that lots of different things have carbs in them. Carbohydrates are not necessarily an evil thing, as some dietitians would try to convince you of. Carbohydrates are a necessary component of a healthy body. The trick is making sure that you're getting the right kind of carbohydrates for what your body needs. All carbohydrates contain three basic elements: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The name carbohydrate actually describes that. We have carbo in reference to the carbon, then hydrate is in reference to the hydrogen and the oxygen. In every carbohydrate, you have twice as many hydrogens as you do oxygens. So you have 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen, or H2O. So carbohydrates are actually found in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. For every 1 carbon, you have 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. When you see a chemical formula with carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and it's in this 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, that's a dead giveaway that it's a carbohydrate. The main examples of carbohydrates that we're going to come across are going to be what we call starches, which are also called complex carbohydrates, and sugars, which are often called simple sugars. The most important function of carbohydrates in the body is that as a source of fuel. Carbohydrates are what provide your body with energy. A lot of athletes already know this, because endurance athletes, like marathon runners, will often do what they call carb loading before a race. What they'll do is eat a lot of carbohydrates because that stores up that energy, that fuel that their body is going to need to go that long distance race. The next question, based on what we just talked about, which of the following molecules is most likely to be a carbohydrate? A hint, think about that 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The building blocks of carbohydrates are simple sugars, or what we call monosaccharides. The root word saccharide comes from saccharin, which means sweet. So monosaccharide is one sugar or one sweet. These are the simplest of the carbs. These are little packages of energy that the cells can use. When we look at simple sugars, you will often see the suffix "-ose" in reference to a simple sugar. So some examples that we have here: glucose, fructose, and galactose. Notice all those names end in the suffix "-ose. So whenever you see "-ose, you should think carb. Glucose is a really important simple sugar, and we'll talk about glucose again and again and again when we talk about how the cells generate energy. So we'll see glucose pop up a lot. These simple sugars are the monomers, the building blocks of more complex carbohydrates. If we take 2 monosaccharides and put them together, we get what we call a disaccharide. Mono means 1, di meaning 2. So a disaccharide is a carbohydrate made from 2 simple sugar molecules bonded together. Probably the most familiar of the disaccharides is sucrose, which is simple table sugar. So sucrose is 1 glucose molecule and 1 fructose molecule bonded together. When you eat simple sugars like sucrose, it's easily broken down and immediately burned away as energy. This is why eating something high in sugar gives you that burst of energy, what we call a sugar rush, but it doesn't last long because your body can burn through these simple sugars very, very quickly. And then you end up with what we call that sugar crash. Another good example of a disaccharide is lactose. Again, notice that ending, ose. That's in reference to a carb. So lactose is made out of one glucose molecule and one galactose molecule. Lactose, as some of you already know, is a sugar that is found in dairy. Now, there are some people, like me, that are lactose intolerant, which means your body doesn't have a very easy time of digesting this sugar. So when you eat dairies, what happens is that lactose gets into your body and your body has a hard time breaking it down. When we take more than 2 monosaccharides and put them together, we get what we call a polysaccharide. The polysaccharide is the polymer of the carbohydrates. So there are a lot of important polysaccharides that we could talk about, but generally we talk about them in terms of starch. Starch is what we find in things like breads and pastas and cereals, where simple sugars give you a quick burst of energy because your body can break that down and turn it into energy really quickly. Polysaccharides give you long-lasting energy because your body has to work at breaking them down. So most starches are just chains of glucose molecules. So as you eat something like a bowl of spaghetti, what your body has to do is break down those starch molecules into individual glucose molecules to turn that into energy. So your body takes longer to break it down, so it gives you a lot long-lasting energy. So going back to those marathon runners, they're going to carb load on something like pasta because that's going to give them the energy long enough to run a 26.2 mile race. If a marathon runner loaded up on like Snickers bars or something where it's just a lot of sugar, a lot of simple sugars, then they would have a burst of energy right at the beginning of the race, and then about 1 mile in, they would be totally done. One of the important starches that we're going to come across in the foods we eat is what is called amylose. Amylose is found in a lot of plants like wheat and oats. So this is what we generally make a lot of our starchy foods out of, so breads and pastas. So carbs are a very important source of energy for most organisms. There are some other uses for these polysaccharides as well. Plants generate a type of polysaccharide called cellulose. Cellulose is the main building block of its cell walls. So when you eat vegetables, the crunchy part of the vegetables before it's cooked is the cellulose. Now the difference between starches and cellulose is how those molecules are put together. Starches have all the glucose molecules pointing in the same direction, whereas cellulose has the glucose molecules pointing in opposite directions. Even though these molecules are made out of long chains of glucose, the human body can digest starches, but has a really hard time digesting cellulose. And this has to do with the way that the body breaks down these carbohydrates. Starches are really easy to break down, cellulose is really difficult to break down. Now, there are some animals that specialize in digesting these cellulose, things like cows, and that's why they're happy munching on grass all day, whereas for us, not so much. Now, when you eat a lot of carbs, like you're that marathon runner carb loading right before a race, those carbohydrates that you build up inside your system can actually be stored. And another really important polysaccharide is what is called glycogen. Glycogen has long chains of glucose, but these chains have branches on them. This makes it a little less stable, and the body will actually store glycogen inside of the muscles. So when we store this glycogen, it's right there in the muscles where the body is going to most likely need bursts of energy. Glycogen only lasts for about 24 hours in your system. So if you carb load, you only get about 24 hours before your body is just going to end up burning through that energy anyways. So the next question, what kind of chemical bonds would be found in a polysaccharide molecule? Here's a hint. Think about the word molecule. Would that be a covalent bond, an ionic bond, a hydrogen bond, or none of the above? And finally, which of the following diagrams would represent a disaccharide? Again, think about the prefix di and what that means.